this today. We have, lots of content. We'll get through it in a timely manner so that we have some time for discussion at the end. Just quickly, uh, for our land acknowledgement, SSG has kind of a broad land acknowledgement because we work over such a huge geography. But our work is carried out on unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous territories, ranging from the traditional lands of the Michif-Pee in the north to the Hichies in the south, from the Halkomelem peoples in the west to the Mi'kmaq in the east. And we acknowledge the historical and continued oppression of the original peoples of the land that is currently known as the Americas, and believe that our work must contribute to the healing and decolonizing journey that we all share together. So feel free to put in the chat too what territories you are coming from today. So here are today's presenters. So I'm Jeremy Murphy. I'm an SSG principal for the past 20 years. I'm an urban planner and a climate action planner by training and by 20 years of experience. I am based on the traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people here in Vancouver. And I've worked on, well, probably a dozen or so land use plans to specifically incorporate climate considerations into those. Many of those have projects have been done with Jennifer Fix. Jennifer, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jeremy. Happy to be here, joining you today from Treaty 4 territory, which is in southern Saskatchewan, the traditional homeland of the Naya, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota people, as well as the homeland of the Métis. Most of the work actually we'll be talking about today, including the shared work that Jeremy and I have done together, is in Salish and Coast Salish territory. But I am joining you from about 2,000 kilometers away from that. And I see a couple of folks on the line who are from here as well. So happy to be here. I'm an urban planner. I've done a lot of land use planning at a whole bunch of scales, ranging from kind of the small parcel scale through to the neighborhood, downtown, city, and even regional scales. But I also do a lot of public engagement. And I think kind of the thing that gets me most excited is about when those two things come together in a really deep and meaningful way. And excited today to talk to you specifically about that climate action thread of mitigation and adaptation.
Nice. So our quick agenda for today, which features the word quick several times here because there is a lot that can be discussed on this topic, and we can't dive into it all to the depth that we might want. But we'll do a quick intro to land use plans and an overview of climate and energy elements. We'll get into some climate and energy, the key themes for climate and energy in land use plans, and finally a little overview of how it manifests, or how it can be manifested, I guess, in public planning processes. And then, like I say, we'll have a quick summary and Q&A at the end. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you for your quick intro.
Sure. So when we talk about climate action planning, there's a whole suite of interventions and strategies within local government, and of course many hats that local government wears, from regulator to asset manager to partner, educator, incentive provider. Lots of people probably in the Zoom room who have expertise in all or some of those areas. Today, we're really wanting to do kind of a deep dive specifically around land use planning as one really powerful tool at the disposal of local governments to act on the climate crisis. And so kind of by way of introduction to the land use, we do want to point out that the traditional planning concept of land use is a settler way of viewing the land. And, Indigenous peoples from right across Turtle Island have pointed out that land is sacred. It's the source of life, all life. and you can't separate out culture, story, language, identity, and land. And so, rather than the land simply belonging to people, something to be used or extracted, you know, we've learned as settlers from Indigenous folks that, people belong to the land. People are the land. So kind of want to acknowledge that, especially since there is such an important conversation around kind of Indigenous knowledge in meeting and greeting the climate crisis. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So wanted to start out with that. And then kind of shift gears to, thinking about, okay, what is this legislative tool that we have? We know that, local governments, we're creatures of the province, so we're subject to kind of the permissions that are laid out from our, respective province legislation through the Constitution Act. And there's different versions of what that legislation looks like across Canada. Like we have, in BC, it's the Local Government Act. In Ontario, it's the Planning Act. In Saskatchewan, it's the Planning and Development Act. But really, the ground rules for land use are very similar. So whether we're talking about zoning or kind of that comprehensive, proactive planning, that is, the overarching land use policy plans, OCPs, official plans, municipal development plans. There's some consistency around what those are in relating to land use and growth management across Canada. So for example, this top bullet here, this is how it's framed in Ontario. It's about managing and directing physical change in the land use planning system. That's how they characterize ODP or official plans. In Saskatchewan and elsewhere on the prairie, they talk about sustainable current and future land use development as kind of what the official plan or official community plan ought to do. And then in BC, it's about directing the location, the amount, the type, and the intensity of land uses. The legislation also for OCPs and the like, I'm going to use the word OCP, but please know it's interchangeable throughout the presentation. OCPs are also, in most cases, directed to include policies and actions around affordable housing. In BC, we have a requirement to include greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and policies. And then across the board, we're also seeing restrictions on hazardous and environmentally sensitive lands, which is important as we start thinking about climate adaptation. Next slide, please. So, tools like green electricity and carbon pricing, these are all essential to climate action. But, how we spatially arrange ourselves in our neighborhoods and our cities, that's our focus today. And that's where we're going to really try to drum up some excitement around the possibilities. Next slide, please. And we're going to be, oh, yeah, you go for it. Oh, yeah, you go for it.
Yeah, this is my thing. So, those of you who have worked with SSG and SSG and Ahne Studios before are familiar with the different sectors that we typically focus on for energy use. So energy efficiency measures, typically energy generation measures, renewable energy, and also emissions and where emissions are produced. And so we have, broadly speaking, these 8 sectors. So the energy that's used like to operate buildings, to heat and cool buildings, and provide electricity in buildings. The various modes of transportation, active through personal vehicles, energy generation, of course, agricultural lands and processes, industrial processes, waste and wastewater. Also, sometimes potable water is included in this category. Land conversion and consumed products. And these energy and emissions sectors map pretty directly onto land use plan sectors, the typical sectors that would be addressed in a typical land use plan, with the exception of consumed products, which is usually an extra effort both in climate planning and land use planning if that were to be addressed. It's called Scope 3 emissions, whereas everything else in these different sectors is usually Scope 1 or 2 emissions. So emissions that are produced locally or emissions from energy that is imported to an area. So these are the the emissions and energy sectors that map pretty directly onto land use plan sectors that are addressed. And the starting point for a lot of climate action planning, even when we're talking about land use plans, is the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Uh, that gives you a sense of the current and maybe historical emissions sources and volumes, and it allows you to kind of tailor what your priorities are in land use planning. So, for example, if you're in Calgary versus if you're in Montreal, your priorities might be a little different. So these donut charts are taken from the Municipal Energy and Emissions database that SSG has created a few years ago. This is energy and emissions information that's available to everyone for every municipality in Canada for free. You can go to mead.info to check it out for your town. But you'll see that in Calgary versus Montreal, stationary energy, which is energy used in buildings, is much higher in Calgary. The emissions from it are much higher in Calgary than they are in Montreal. The grid in Alberta uses more fossil fuels. The emissions from that energy use in buildings is responsible for more emissions than it would be in Montreal, where the grid is greener. But in Montreal, a larger portion of the emissions are due to transportation. So maybe in a land use plan for Montreal, you would focus more on transportation solutions to address emissions. So the starting point is important. Getting the data to know where to focus is important. And also to know how you're progressing as you implement your land use plans. So the other side of the climate action coin from mitigation is adaptation. And these are kind of the natural hazards that would typically be addressed in an adaptation plan or in a land use plan that includes adaptation elements, from wildfires all the way through to landslides and unpredictable weather. These hazards are increasing in frequency, typically across the country, across all the countries we work in. And the severity is also increasing. So if we're just kind of doing status quo land use development without considering these, we are putting those developments at great and increasing risk. And so the climate action aspect of land use planning when it comes to adaptation is to know what the projections are for these hazards, where they are going to happen, how frequently they're going to happen, how severely they are going to be, and how we can, as land use planners, adapt to those expected impacts. So we'll get into both the mitigation and adaptation elements here, and I'll pass it back to Jennifer for talking a bit about some of the work we've done.
Sure. We're going to focus a little bit on that OCP level of intervention in terms of land use planning, though we do want to point out that a lot of what we'll be talking about is transferable to other scales, like neighborhood plans, for example. And we're going to talk a little bit about Courtney, which is a community we've worked in to help them with their net zero emissions official community plan. So kind of this process invited us to kind of step back and look at land use planning at the 10,000 foot view to see the kind of the city system of Courtney as kind of a web of relationships and some of the emerging behaviors that make up the whole that come through those relationships, and to identify those levers within it in which we could mitigate and adapt to the changing climate. It was a few years ago now that City Council in Courtney declared a climate crisis, and they tasked their staff to create an official community plan that could reach kind of net zero emissions by 2050 and getting halfway there by 2030. And so I was part of a team of consultants ranging from transportation to infrastructure to land economics, and of course SSG leading the climate action piece to craft this OCP that tried to meet those goals. And we started out by trying to understand where we stand today wanting to know how to best tackle the emergency really began with understanding our current emissions, to Jeremy's points earlier, because it does vary based on jurisdiction. And so here you can see SSG's presented Courtney's emissions by sectors, where they're showing, significant emissions within the city's boundary, and within the jurisdiction and influence of City Hall. Buildings, most notably residential and transportation, really revealing themselves here to be the biggest levers within which they had influence. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. And so this is a current land use map in Courtney, which simplifies what would otherwise be a very detailed zoning map into aggregate zones of residential, commercial, office, mixed use, industrial, institutional. So on the building side, land use zoning and policy shapes the types of buildings and homes in a community. It dictates the composition of residential buildings, whether we're talking about, single family homes, single detached homes, just an array of multifamily homes, multi-unit homes. And so with shared walls and other efficiencies, these are the latter buildings are the type that produce lower greenhouse gas emissions. On the transportation side here in Courtney, this is the largest contributor to local greenhouse gas emissions. And though local governments obviously can't regulate vehicle emission standards, they do have direct control over the degree to which residents can travel by foot, bicycle, and transit. And this is because land use, so the type, the location, the intensity of these different uses, these different land-based activities, they are a primary driver of transportation behavior. And you've heard that, I'm sure many of you have heard that that the best transportation plan is a land use plan. We can kind of extend that line of thinking to assert that, in fact, the land use plan can be a climate action plan as well. Now, if you look at the research, there's a huge body of research around this, and there are 3 ways in which land use are really major drivers behind transportation behaviors and therefore greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of how people choose to get around and the choices available to them for getting around. And I'll just walk through those 3 big drivers in the next few slides. So the first one is land use mix. So this, of course, refers to, the diversity of land uses within a particular area. So we're talking about residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, agriculture, et cetera, where we know that, higher degrees of the land use mix are associated with complete communities where residents have easy access to a variety of amenities and services within their neighborhood. So this map here in Courtney is showing existing conditions at the point of, producing the map using current data. And it's showing, in green here, dark green, the residents that are within a 5-minute walk of different retail uses. And then the lighter green is folks kind of under between that 6 and 10 minute. And we know from research that after 10 minutes, folks are unlikely to take a destination oriented trip on foot or on bike if it's beyond that threshold. So having those uses close to home is really, really key in guiding that behavior. And we also know that there are a whole bunch of co-benefits associated with living in a community full of mix of uses. Stronger sense of community, residents are more likely to know their neighbors, there's more trust, people are more likely to participate politically, people are more likely to form community networks and support those mom and pop shops, those local businesses that are close to home. Next slide, please. Sometimes it can be challenging to find all the right data or accurate data. Sometimes it's not cost effective to do that sort of mapping. So in some instances, we'll work with communities just to use, to look at grocery stores specifically, because there's such a strong proxy for walkability in terms of land use. It's the #1 trip generator outside home and school. And so it's something we look at to help understand how walkable from a land use perspective a community might be. So we see here, for example, only 1 in 5 residents within Courtney are within walking distance of a grocery store. So that provides us some insight as we start thinking about modeling land use scenarios for the future. Next slide, please. We also look at things like elementary schools, knowing that, of course, for the health of children, we want to have those schools within walking distance of home. but also in creating a kind of a culture of active low carbon travel early on for kids. Having this is important. Having, a density of homes around schools is important. Next slide, please. And employment space. This is a little bit trickier because actually we did this work right before everything shut down with COVID-19 and all the restrictions around pandemic. So it'd be interesting to have a look at this now. But we also know that employment density and employment location is also one of the most important drivers around transportation behavior and then transportation related greenhouse gas emissions in our cities. Next slide, please. So that's land use mix. The other major driver relating specifically to land use in our cities is density. So this, of course, refers to the number of, we could talk about people, homes, or jobs within a certain area. This particular map is talking about or showing population density. So we know that higher population density also often coming in the form of multi-unit housing generally results in energy savings and reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the buildings themselves. They also translate into more transportation choices, including a larger proportion of trips taken by foot, bike transit. And we know, again, from established research, that we need to see at least about 32 people per hectare before we start seeing even a minor shift away from predominantly vehicle use. So this is the colors you see here, kind of those darker colors meet those minimum thresholds. Outside of those areas, they fall short. So that, again, provides us some really important insight when we start thinking about land use planning and some of the scenario work that SSG does for GHG emissions. Next slide, please. And the third major driver around transportation behavior as it relates to land use is urban form and connectivity. So street connectivity is a measure of travel directness and availability of alternate routes within a network. So what it really does is influences kind of the real travel distance between a point of origin. That point of origin could be home, for example, and a destination, whether it's transit stop, a grocery store, a school. So connectivity, how well connected that network is again one of the most significant factors in both the frequency of the trips and the quantity of those trips. And so this is again showing Courtney. The blue is showing connected streets, whereas the green is showing dead end and loop streets, cul-de-sacs. Streets that are serving the adjacent property, but not, a network intended for people passing through and navigating the system overall. You can see where it's most tightly clustered. This is the downtown. This is an area that was developed over 100 years ago before the widespread adoption of vehicles. And then you can see the pattern totally changing elsewhere, where we have the advent and rise of the automobile and vehicle-oriented design. Next slide, please. Now, in measuring this in a community, again, to inform land use planning and how urban form relates to land use planning, one way to measure it is intersection density. So again, knowing from research that there's a minimum of about 50 intersections per square kilometer or half an intersection per hectare, you need that before we start seeing pedestrian travel becoming more commonplace. And you can see, again, this totally mimics the previous slide where we're seeing, urban form looking quite different before the rise of the automobile and the greenhouse gas emissions that go along with that. Next slide, please. And then on the ground, this is really illustrating what it looks like. Oh, we have a note here saying that presentation is lost.
I think if you just click on the top, there's two tabs, one that says meeting and one that says Jeremy Murphy SSG screen. You'll be able to see the presentation.
Okay, I'm glad it's not a me problem, because usually if there's a tech problem, it's a Jennifer problem. It's the Jennifer the problem. And this is kind of showing this phenomenon on the ground. So these are street pattern diagrams showing 3 different locations in Courtney. The one on the far left showing, one of those walkable locations in the downtown where the real travel distance, the 5-minute walking distance, which is about 400 meters, is the same on the ground as the crow flies. Whereas you start to see in different locations, the street network not being as permeable, not being as connected, how that starts to translate into longer walking distance till you get to a point where 400-meter distance as a crow flies, which should totally be walkable if it was in street network, crosses that threshold where people are unlikely going to take a trip on foot. And again, the implications for greenhouse gas emissions are enormous. So just really wanting to not understate the importance of urban form as it relates to land use planning as we tackle the climate mitigation. Next slide, please. So those were some of the snippets of a more comprehensive analysis we undertook and that SSG undertook around, GHG emissions. So what we did is we took all that information. We took also the learnings and the guiding principles, the priorities, the vision that came from the community, and created different scenarios that looked at population projections, what that meant for demand for different housing, and situating that in different locations in Courtenay to explore what that would mean for greenhouse gas emissions. And that's where SSG comes into play and a really robust analysis around that. So I'll hand it over to Jeremy to take it away.
Thanks. So Jennifer talked about all the different kind of land use planning considerations, key considerations. And the way SSG kind of interfaces with kind of more traditional or I guess actually it's more of a modern land use planning approach is through scenario modeling. And so the different growth scenarios that Jennifer just showed on the last slide in the map, we model those in a fairly sophisticated piece of software that we've created called Senna. There's a variety of different flavors of Senna, from community to energy applications and everything in between. And it's a activity-based model, so it's like ground up data. I mean, from bottom up data, not like ground up data, bottom up data. And it models all of the activity, like the energy using activity of a city or town. And so that includes everything that's used in all of the sectors that I presented earlier. Those kind of 7 or 8 key sectors. And so we model these different scenarios. We can do it for mitigation type emissions related activities. And we can also do it for adaptation interventions and all of the different natural hazards and other hazards as well that I showed earlier. And these are some of the results we get out of the modeling. We can see on the top of these graphs, this is energy use on the left and emissions on the right. The business as usual line at the top of these graphs is the status quo for land use development in Courtenay in this case. And so, if we don't do anything, if we just kind of keep going the way we're going in terms of land use and develop the way we've been developing, we get, lots of energy use and lots of emissions compared to if we do land use a little differently and kind of do it more along the lines of those mixed use, more dense approaches that Jennifer was talking about. So in this case, the difference in energy use between our status quo and a distributed or a compact approach to land use planning is fairly significant. This is like a 30% drop in how much energy you would use. And that's energy across all sectors. So it includes transportations, buildings, et cetera. And then the emissions drop is even more significant. This is like a 90% drop in emissions. Interestingly, in this case, in this jurisdiction, energy use and emissions are dropping under the status quo, and that is mostly because the grid has been greening. It's very green in BC now. And also new buildings are getting more efficient. It's a little bit due to fuel efficiency and new vehicles and that sort of thing. But the big reason why energy use is decreasing and emissions are decreasing under the status quo is because it's getting warmer. Climate is changing, it's getting warmer, and so cooling or heating degree days are lessening. So we're going to need less fuels and electricity to heat in the winters. So this is how we can break down some of the energy use in the modeling that we do. So we can map it to different sectors like you would have in a land use plan. And we can do this is a business as usual on the left, so status quo, and the compact growth scenario on the right. And we can see that, across all sectors except for industry, because there weren't industrial actions in this particular example for the land use plan, uh, energy is decreased. So there are all these energy efficiency measures across building sectors. We're transitioning to electric vehicles, we're transitioning to active transportation. And so the actual energy use in the community decreases significantly. And this typically translates to some pretty big savings across the community for residents and businesses. Less energy use equals lower utility bills. And then a similar story for emissions. We can map it by sector. We can also break this down into subsectors. So like, the different kinds of trips you would make in transportation, the different types of residential or commercial buildings or what have you. It's quite specific. And in addition to graphs like these, there are also a host of maps that we make to map all the energy emissions, et cetera, intensities across the city. But this gives us the information, right? This gives us the information we need to say, well, we can stick with the status quo, but that's not helping us achieve our goals. And part of our goals is to be happier, healthier, less pollution. And under a high carbon, high energy use scenario, we're not achieving those goals. But under an energy efficient, low carbon scenario, we have cleaner air, we have healthier people, et cetera. There's a host of benefits to it. And so the scenario modeling really helps us prove that the actions that we would want to take, the policies that we would want to implement in a land use plan will achieve the goals that we want for the community. Now, in planning for future climate impacts, we do a similar kind of scenario modeling where we have kind of the current baseline year conditions. We know, floods for different types of water bodies occur at certain intervals to certain severities given our historical data. And then we can project that out as a business as usual scenario. So the status quo, how are those hazards going to occur in the future? How often will they be? How severe will they be? How much money will it cost to recover from those impacts when they happen? And then we can also model adaptive scenarios. And so these are scenarios in which we implement certain land use plans and policies and other actions for infrastructure or tree cover or cooling in buildings or what have you to produce an alternative scenario that lessens the impacts that are expected and lessens the costs of responding to those impacts. And so just as a quick example, we have, let's call this a typical town next to a lake, between a lake and a river, and there's development pressure in this town. This is a popular place. It's got a lake, and people want to move there. And this is where, this is the natural place for projected development, added population in that corner of the town. But it's on a floodplain for this river that's like a 1 in 100 year flood. The problem, though, is that a 1 in 100 year flood is becoming more like a 1 in 10 year flood. And every time it floods, it's about $800 million in damages. Clearly, we want to avoid this from happening. We don't want the damage to the buildings, to the rest of the infrastructure. We don't want to pay the money to fix all of the damages when they've occurred. So we can model that. We can say, well, what happens when we put in a flood wall along the river? And we can see that, well, it still floods in some of the neighborhood, but the damages are greatly mitigated. And then, well, what happens when we put in building bylaws that say, well, if you are going to build in a floodplain, you have to build to certain flood-proof standards. And that has an additional beneficial effect. And then we can model green infrastructure or what have you. And once we add up all of the interventions, we can say, well, if we do these things through our land use plan and other policies, we can expect that the costs will be decreased, the affected properties will be decreased, the people saved in terms of like wildfire or air pollution deaths or what have you will be decreased. And these are increasingly important pieces of information to have as these types of impacts are projected to occur more often. So we take all of this information and we can map it all. And so here's an example in Kelowna where we mapped the urban heat island effect. And so the urban heat island effect today, we can see in the darker red zones along kind of the main corridors, transportation corridors and downtown in Kelowna, it gets pretty hot, average temperatures over the course of the year. And in 2070, it is going to be way worse, right? These like dark red areas, the urban heat that is deemed excessive to human comfort is going to be much worse. So we use a lot of climate data from various sources to project the heat levels out like this, along with all the other hazards. And then we can map the interventions to see what the effect of those interventions will be. And so even though in the third panel at the bottom here, the heat island is a little worse than it is today in 2070, the interventions have really done a lot to mitigate the worst possible outcomes that we're seeing in the 2070 map. So we can map it all, we do the scenarios, and we get the results with which to make decisions that are going to protect us. So, you saw the heat island effect one, there's floods, there's all the other hazards that we can map. And putting it all together, we can see the multi-hazard maps today versus multi-hazards in 2070. And this gives us an idea of like where to prioritize across all of the different hazards. Where should we put our interventions? What neighborhoods? What types of buildings should we be building? How many trees should we be planting? What are the priority buildings for implementing cooling policies, that sort of thing. So this information is essential for anyone who is trying to plan for future impacts like this. So I'll turn it back to Jennifer here to talk about how some of these things get integrated into land use plans.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I think I was maybe a bit too ambitious with the number of slides I've added here. So we're just wanting to be mindful of time and the folks who have questions. I'm going to move through these next ones quite quickly. But in response to some of the risks that Jeremy mentioned, parks, even though typically administered through a comprehensive parks and recreation plan, for example, instead of an OCP, land use plans like OCPs are still very important in terms of creating the kind of that policy direction around parks and open space. We know obviously on the mitigation side, these are important and very vital carbon sinks. And on the mitigation side, or rather the adaptation side, urban cooling, flood management, biodiversity support, creating shade and cooling spaces during heat waves, particularly for those who maybe are more vulnerable, don't have access to air conditioning spaces, really essential. This image here on the right is showing, is from the city of New Westminster, where they've just recently, I was supporting them on their People Parks Play plan, which is really focused on climate resilience and ensuring that vulnerable populations that they have access to misting stations and other cooling infrastructure in times of heat. Next slide. I think we'll just skip over the canopy one.
Okay.
And then, it's a good segue into, that's parks is really about, public asset management, but another really important tool, that really relates directly to land use planning and land use plans are design guidelines and BC development permit areas, zoning. Again, they kind of sound and look different depending on the jurisdiction. The effective outcome is the same. We are really trying to encourage those important measures that prepare communities for climate change at the site level. So some of them are direct to climate action, around, energy conservation, for example. Others are more indirect. So here, these are, I worked on the Abbotsford OCP years ago and creating very, very detailed kind of design guidelines or development permit area guidelines, ensuring that development is really going to support a strong pedestrian environment, which relates to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Next slide, please. And then more on the adaptation side, there's lots around water conservation, managing hazardous lands, how to mitigate wildfire risks, floods, establishing flood construction levels, controlling steep slope development, minimizing erosion along shorelines, landscaping in a way, planting zones, rain gardens, swales, providing sufficient soil volumes to encourage tree growth, etc. All of these measures that are really essential to being resilient to a changing climate can be found in land use plans and land use regulations. Next slide. And we can't have a conversation about land use planning without talking about process. And when I started in planning school, I thought, really, we know what the problems are and we just need to implement them. And then, of course, when you get into practice, you soon understand that it's a little bit more complicated. People deserve to be part of decisions that affect their lives. And some folks, folks living rough, living in poverty, racialized folks, others who are, socially excluded, for example, there needs to be special effort to ensure that their lived experience is incorporated and embraced as part of climate action planning. We also know that people hold knowledge. Every urban resident is an expert in the city because they inhabit it. They have a unique experience of navigating the city. We also know that change is difficult. Change is political. Change, particularly the magnitude of change that's required here, is polarizing. So we know that folks are more likely to support an outcome of a planning process in which they may disagree with that outcome, but if they've been involved and been part of the process, they're more likely to support it. And then, of course, when we talk about complex systems in land use planning, that extends to people relationships. So there's a real opportunity in these planning processes in co-creating plans to foster relationships between people and building those social bonds that'll be increasingly important as in the face of climate emergencies. So many reasons for really doing robust participatory planning and design in climate action planning. And we'll just skip this next slide. And then we touched on it earlier, but Indigenous peoples have been living on the land, stewarding their territory since time immemorial. There's a deep knowledge of natural systems and millennia of experience that are really part of a traditional ecological knowledge that is such a complement to Western climate science. So, in addition to, First Nations self-determined, self-governing climate adaptation and land use planning efforts on their territories, Indigenous knowledge can also be embraced in colonial land use plans. And so this is just an example from a storytelling circle from a Tsleil-Waututh First Nation community feast and supper in Vancouver, where we came to understand how traditional knowledge, culture, ways of knowing could permeate all facets of a land use plan in Vancouver in their traditional unceded territory. Next slide, please. And we're seeing this happening in Jericho Lands, which is the largest Indigenous-led real estate project in Canada, Ilamuch, Jericho Lands, where nature-based solutions, the whole approach of thinking about water as a living entity and a part of a system that connects all flora and fauna, really shaping the way the land is managed and how land use policy is shaping up. And then finally, I'll just speak to this last piece, which we can sometimes forget about. Next slide, please. Engaging within City Hall. When we think about engagement, we often look outward, but it's so important to look inward. And especially as we know, as I mentioned earlier, that change can be very polarized, it can be very political, and it can be a barrier to implementation, meaningful change. And so just one example I wanted to leave you with, it's kind of a hopeful one. It's the Abbotsford Official Community Plan, which I worked on and was adopted in 2016. We did a lot of the work on it that Jeremy was describing earlier around modeling and informed decision making around transportation and land use and greenhouse gas emissions. And they really had a concerted effort to engage internal across departments, across realms within City Hall, including council. And Brent Todderan was involved in that process, and he really spoke a lot about this idea of gut check moments. And once this plan is adopted, the real work begins, and that there are going to be, alluring developments or pressures from local developers who are accustomed to doing things the old way, which was very, very kind of poor growth management, I would say. But saying no to that sort of thing would mean saying yes to the vision that they had for their city, which is one that provided an abundance of transportation choice, was compact, beautiful public spaces, public life, and so on. Next slide, please. And so 8 years on, after adoption of the plan, city staff brought forward a progress report. And because they had really stuck to their guns on this OCP, they discovered that they were not only meeting, but they were actually exceeding their targets around densification. So the urban core target of 60% was surpassed, 65%. Same for focusing growth within existing neighborhoods and infill and in neighborhood centers. And new neighborhoods, which are kind of those new suburban neighborhoods, they were hoping to limit to a quarter of new growth, was actually 7%. So I mean, there's lots of things at play here, lots of forces, including market and development patterns and pressures. But I think it's a real great success story, and just really underscores the importance of having that engagement, that meaningful engagement internal to City Hall. Jeremy, I'll hand it back to you.
All right. I'll just do a quick summary here, and then we'll have a tiny bit of time for discussion. I'll answer some of the questions in the chat. But just to kind of summarize, there are adaptation and mitigation, climate considerations to make in land use plans now. Some jurisdictions require it. Other jurisdictions should be requiring it, in my opinion. But a lot of the adaptation and mitigation actions, there's a large overlap in terms of actions that you would take, policies that you would make in land use plans that address both adaptation and mitigation measures. And I think, as we all know, there's a host of benefits, many of which Jennifer has been talking about, that come with climate action. And so it's not really an add-on, I feel, to land use plans anymore to be incorporating mitigation and adaptation actions and policies and direction. It's really just an expansion of what we're already trying to do with land use plans, and we're just embedding it more like it should be in terms of addressing those considerations. And this is a quick page from the Courtney OCP. I think what was really effective in that OCP is that the vision and the goals right from the get-go of updating their plan was to include climate action. It was a fundamental aspect of the planning process, of the engagement process, coming up with the different land use policies. Courtney wanted a net zero town, and that's what they started out to plan around, those principles. And I think the integration is important, and that's really the only way that it really gets embedded into the plans and gets implemented in the community.